Just, I'm delighted to have this chance to discuss your new book entitled Enduring Ruin, The Environmental Destruction and the Irish Revolution,
Hmm.
published by UCD Press. Uh, I suppose the first thing that strikes me is the term environmental destruction in the
Mm.
title. And I think this fits in neatly with a wider interest in environmental history in all areas of history, but particularly conflict and warfare.
Hmm.
And of course, it's a very broad term.
Yeah.
So I thought first maybe you could set the scene for us by giving us a sense of how you interpret environmental history in the context of the Irish Revolution.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a question I kind of batted around in my head because if I were, and I introduce this in the book that I say this is maybe not a pure environmental history. And what I mean by that is that it's an environmental history of the conflict surrounding the Irish Revolution. And I interpret that as meaning human beings' interaction with the environment as it pertains to violence, preparing of ambush sites, or the destruction of the built environment in some way, ways in which human beings alter the environment. Is how I'm interpreting this. Now, you might say, well, that sounds like environmental history to me. The things that I was cautious about using the term because there's other things going on in the 1916 to 23 period that could be considered to be involved in environmental history, particularly projects of afforestation, ongoing projects of land transfer, reclamation of wasteland, and things like that. I don't deal with that in the book because I took a specific line to look at simply the environmental destruction as it pertained to the conflict. So in that sense, it's almost like maybe a subdivision of environmental history, certainly, as you say, aligned to the military conflict.
And you take us really through in quite thoroughly through the entire period from 1916 to 1923, and your first chapter on 1916, the destruction of Dublin.
Mm.
I will admit, when I read it first, I thought, well, we've just been through the centenary. We've had a
Yeah.
lot written on
Hmm.
1916. Is there much new to say? Because, well, we've all seen the pictures of Dublin. In fact, you'd written on it before
Yeah.
yourself, making some comparisons between Dublin and some of the cities in along the Western Front.
Mm.
But actually, what struck me reading this chapter was that you took up almost where a lot of other studies have left off. A lot of other studies have given us wonderfully detailed accounts of what happened in those 6 very intense days. But when they've looked to the aftermath and the legacy, it's tended to hive off into what happened to the rebels and what happened politically. Whereas you keep us situated almost on the streets of Dublin, giving us an account of, if for want of a better word, the cleanup job.
Yeah.
So I wonder, could you say a bit more about that, about your
Mhm.
um, why you chose that focus, but also where you think this chapter in your book adds to the wider literature on 1916.
Yeah, I will. I'll answer the second part first. I think what it contributes to the history of 1916 and the Rising is that it provides almost a sensory history of the Rising in regards to the sights and sounds and smells and feels of the Rising, whether that be the smell of death in various quarters, the loud artillery bombardment, or the different kind of reports of the gunfire that people are hearing. But in situating myself into a study of the Rising, I wanted to get on the ground level. I wanted to look at this from not only the individual or collective social point of view, but from the environmental point of view. And for that, the Rising doesn't end with the arrest and deportation of men and women and the execution of the rebellion leaders. There's much cleanup to be done, and there's a city that people are continuing to live in and navigate and put back together. I was fortunate to find some nice material in the Dublin City archives, particularly the minute books of the city council. When I said, well, there's got to be an increased vote toward funding for cleanup, and certainly there was. But what we see, I think, in the aftermath of the Rising is the consequence of it in different environmental forms. I was particularly struck by the ways in which certain buildings were deemed unfit for habitation after they'd suffered damage. They had to be pulled down, and then you've got crashing bricks and mortar and debris floating around the city even after the guns have been silenced. This is something, as you mentioned, like my previous work on the environmental destruction on the Western Front, that really struck my mind. It's something that that doesn't expire with the end of the conflict. It was particularly interesting, I think, in terms of, for lack of a better term, recycling the revolution. There's loads of bricks that need to be piled up, and they can be reused in different ways. And certainly in the years after the rising, debris is still able to be seen along the sides of the streets, and certain businesses adapt to closures and damage as well by striking up different storefronts in different ways. But overall, I think the cleanup of the rising is something that brings home the human element of the experience of war and destruction. And we see that in all conflicts. Damage is the first kind of indicator of a wider conflict.
Yeah, I'll admit I hadn't thought about things like aspects of the cleanup job. I mean, we know from the necrology of 1916 prepared by Glasnevin that there were almost 500 fatalities. But it never actually occurred to me how the logistics
Yeah.
of dealing with deceased bodies, both human but also animal. Horses, other animals that died in the conflict, having to dispose of those carcasses, those sort of maybe mundane aspects of it had never occurred to me before. And I think it was it was a bit of a wake-up call, just the level of detail that you've gone into, and that level of experience on the ground once the fighting was over, and just what Dublin Corporation was faced with. And I think while it took a long time to rebuild the city, I think the corporation probably did an amazing job in getting life back to normal as fast as they did. I love the title of your book, first of all, Enduring Ruin. And I think the 1916 gives us a very good sense of one meaning of that title, that the city endured ruin. I want to come back to the other meaning of it towards the end of our discussion. Moving on from 1916, of course, it's not the entire period you cover wasn't one in which there was conflict throughout. And I did when I finished the 1916 chapter, I thought, well, and I looked at the next one, which is sort of 1917, the interregnum, if you like, between the Rising and the War of Independence. And I thought, well, there's no knocking down of buildings or cutting down trees to block roads. So what will be the focus of an environmental history of the revolutionary years, looking at those 2 years? And one thing that you focus on is the use of space. Could you tell us a bit more about maybe how you chose the focus of environment in these years when there wasn't any fighting, and about specific themes you look at there, such as the use of space?
Yeah, of course. I think you're very right. The studies of the revolution tend to see 1917, 1918 as downtime. And of course, that's because we're looking at this through maybe a purely military lens, but certainly in the political sense, there's much activity happening. In an environmental sense, it's the years where we see kind of a reimagining of space, and maybe utilizing of space, maybe toward political ends, but ways in which the feel and the nature of an environmental space changes or can be changed through political action. And the examples I think that I'd like to highlight from the book have to do with say political prisoners returning back to their hometowns, and supporters flooding like railway stations, transforming these platforms, which would be typically mundane meeting places for people stepping off a train, into political rallying points, changing the feel and the nature through the use of through the appearance of crowds that are swelling up into support them. This changes people's interaction with space, and it changes the ways in which people anticipate interacting with space regarding the presence of, say, political bodies. There's other things that I find it's almost comical in some ways. The support for Sinn Féin we see in the posting of posters or of the tying of tricolor flags almost creates a back and forth between Sinn Féin supporters and the police, who are trying to take down these symbols, and those who are trying to put them up. And so this contestation over public space becomes something that changes the environmental aspect of those areas.
Of course, then after that period, the downtime of 1718, we're back into conflict again with the War of Independence. I don't think it's unfair to say that the real meat of the book is in those two chapters, which deals with the War of Independence. One looking at the environmental aspect from the IRA perspective, and one from the Crown Forces, looking at particular at the destruction to the urban environment caused by Crown Force reprisals. And I must say here that I found these particularly useful myself in my own teaching. This is an aspect of the revolution I've been hoping to integrate into my own teaching, and really until your book came along, there wasn't very much that I could do it. So I used it with my own undergraduates this year, and they found it extremely useful. So thank you for that.
It's exciting to hear. Thank you. Yeah.
But one, I sort of an idea coming from other environmental historians of war that you use as a, I suppose, an interpretive lens in these chapters is the sense of the natural environment, perhaps, well, I suppose the built environment as well, as on the one hand being a weapon of war. I think one of your chapter titles describes the environment as a fifth column.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, as a victim of war. So could you elaborate on those two aspects of the environment in the context of the War of Independence?
Yeah. In the first sense, as a tool of war, as I read more into Ireland's environmental history, particularly in the early modern era, it's no secret that colonization is slowed by the presence of thick trees and bogs and natural environments that impede colonial progress. And I thought about that in the ways that we can interpret the use of the landscape during the War of Independence. Now, of course, by this time, Ireland's physical landscape has changed significantly over the centuries. But for the members of the Irish Republican Army who would look to engage British Crown Forces in some ways to offset the imbalance of firepower, if you will, we see them utilize the environment in ways that lend themselves to an environmental history of the destruction of the land. But we see the interpretation of that land as I mentioned, as a fifth column, as something perhaps as an ally to the guerrilla forces. And I was struck, I think, initially by the records of this within the Irish newspapers. Now, I think typically the Irish newspapers would report on the felling of trees or the blocking of a river or a flood or something as a way to inform the public, perhaps to get around these obstacles that have been created. But the more and more they're reported, the more we can quantify and locate, geolocate these areas and set them against more established records of IRA activity. As a fifth column as well, there's certain aspects of Ireland's environment that are beneficial, even though they might seem detrimental to everyday life. And I mentioned roads. The road systems in Ireland, particularly in the rural areas, are quite, if not underdeveloped, then under maintenance. Roads are difficult to traverse for the heavy lorries that the British Crown Forces are using to pursue rebels. Often very, very muddy and wet and full of ruts. That coupled with the felling of trees, as you mentioned, as a way to secure an ambush site, I think contributes to the ways in which the guerrilla forces used Ireland's environment as a fifth column. And then certainly the environment as victim is symbiotic with that. To use, say, a tree is to destroy a tree. To use a road is to trench it and then therefore get away from the initial utility of that road. But the environment as a victim, we also see in the built environment, obviously, in the other chapter on Crown Force reprisals, in which not only are certain portions of city centers destroyed, but the environment is seen as a detriment to the British Crown Force control of an area. And so the looking out for felled trees or blocked roads becomes part and parcel of British Crown Force policy of pursuing rebels.
Well, of course, you mentioned roads there, which the Irish, as people who live in rural Ireland might say, the roads are still not very well maintained. Of course, one thing the Irish love to talk about is the weather.
Yeah,
And when I got to the section on the weather and guerrilla warfare, I thought this is about as Irish as you can get.
yeah.
Can you say something about the importance of weather in the War of Independence and weather conditions?
Yeah, the conclusions I had on the weather were actually the opposite of what I anticipated they would be. 1920 in particular is very wet. There's portions of the book where I deal with the statistics of average rainfall in that year over a 30-year period, and it exceeds all averages in 1920. And I thought initially, like, this would be very detrimental to military movements, as typically they are for a conventional military. But for a guerrilla force, the weather is used almost as cover, as a way to silence movements, as a way to ensure that the weather is not a harbinger to activity. The 1920 in particular, that's very wet. As I said, surprised me. Not regarding that it was wet in Ireland. That shouldn't surprise anybody. But that military movements were not hindered by that in the guerrilla context, was a bit shocking. It also contributes in other ways to the fifth column idea that I had before in softening roads and making them impassable. But it doesn't affect the IRA's ability or desire, that is, to continue on with its campaign throughout 1920. What it does affect in some ways is health. There's a number of records of people. This comes from the military pension files. Later on, people are claiming, that they've been put up because they've suffered pneumonia. They've suffered a severe wetting, as the language of the time suggests. And so they're still operating in terrible weather, and they're suffering health consequences because of it as well.
Before we've been going chronologically through all the various conflicts, but at this point in the discussion of all of the different phases of your book, you've spoken about sources. So you've spoken about the Dublin Corporation minutes, you've spoken about the Irish newspapers of the period, and
Mhm.
now about the military service pensions. So now might be a good idea, a good opportunity. Now might be a good point in our discussion to elaborate on the sources you used. And I suppose also a question I was wondering was, could a history like this have been written even 10 years ago? Or have recent developments, particularly the release of military service pensions collection, but also the compensation files? I know
Yes.
you've used the Damaged Property
Yeah.
Compensation Act files, the Finance Compensation series in the National Archives. How important were those recent releases in enabling you to write a book like this at this point?
Well, you're very right to identify the compensation files as kind of foundational for this, because it really set me up in thinking about environment almost through the back door, in the sense that when property is destroyed in any kind of context, there's going to be maybe a paper trail, at least in Ireland, and with the extent of the British record system, there's a paper trail of that. So even if someone had a tree felled on their property, they might report that for compensation purposes, for insurance purposes. Now, the records I compile of damage to property come from these compensation claims. Now, we can take them as somewhat accurate, but in other ways, there might be hundreds or even thousands of cases of environmental damage that weren't claimed. That, say, a broken window or a felled tree or a blocked road were simply patched up by the homeowner or cleared by some of the locals. Um, so the compensation files, the criminal injury files that preceded them were important in creating a database for cataloging damage and for really quantifying the amount of damage, the saturation of that damage in any certain area. And I haven't gotten into this, is perhaps for a future project, for the amount of compensation that was given for repairing. So the compensation files are important, and you're right. Their release within the last decade made this book timely in using them and presenting an environmental view of the period. So too did the access to the Bureau of Military History witness statements. Now, they've been available for some time, and I mentioned this in the book, that if they were, they were available in some form to former scholars, but typically in hard copy only. So you could maybe integrate a dozen or 2 dozen of these files into a work a decade ago. Now they are digitized and keyword searchable. And I was able to really capitalize on the access of the Bureau of Military History witness statements. It's tricky though. They're not writing in an environmental context. They perhaps will talk about an ambush, but the witness will not go into details as to how that was particularly prepared. Some will. And it's through the narratives of the witness statements that we can see the struggle to down a very old oak tree, or the difficulty in digging in a compacted road to trench that area. You see a lot in the witness statements about the scale of destruction. They talk about the destruction of Cork City, for example, in great detail. They talk about the destruction of Dublin, and my chapter on the Easter Rising is informed quite a lot by the witness statements. You have to help me out. The PLIC files for 1916 are also digitized. What is the acronym?
The Property Losses Ireland Committee.
Property Losses Ireland Commission. That was very helpful because it talks quite a lot about substantial and consequential damage to, say, goods that grocers or companies had that were destroyed as well. So we can get a sense of the compounded damage that the Rising inflicted. Looking towards the Civil War, I know we'll talk about that period in a bit, but the property compensation files for the Civil War were particularly interesting in the sense that they often dealt with individual claims for losses to environment. As roads were blocked, different paths were cut through a neighbor's yard or field to get where people are going, and people claimed damage for destruction in that sense. But overall, I found it really a study that demanded me to quantify the scale of damage by looking at newspaper reports, by looking at individual narratives, and to weigh that against the compensation files that people are filing for insurance purposes. So it's quite maybe an unorthodox source material that I was using, or maybe using it in an unorthodox way. But still, the CO 904 files with the for Dublin Castle records were helpful to locating activity, and then you would go deeper, looking at the newspapers that would detail individual activity in an area.
Well, the discussion there of the Damaged Property Compensation Act claims brings us neatly to the Civil War, and in that conflict, you had a group who are fighting against their former comrades. Now, having been aware of how the pre-truce IRA had used the environment to its advantage to set ambushes on the unwitting Crown forces, do you find any sense that the Free State Army, having been in the role of the saboteurs themselves previously as IRA men, were a bit more wise to that? Or is there much difference in the nature of the warfare and the impact on the environment during the Civil War from the War of Independence, which preceded it?
Yeah, it's a very funny period in lots of ways, but from an environmental sense, the Civil War presents a culmination of many environmental issues that are preceding the conflict. The quest for land and land grabbing reemerges in intense ways. Agrarian violence reemerges in very intense ways in the spring of 1922 and into the autumn. The Free State forces have an about face in some ways. The very techniques that they were using to frustrate and cripple the movements and the mobility of Crown forces are now seen as irregular, right? Are now seen as something that's beyond the conventions of warfare, which is quite ironic, given that they are the ones that are using and perfecting these techniques. And to go back to the source material, the Irish military archives, from the Republican point of view, have a lot through captured documents show that the manipulation of the environment remains a priority as a way to frustrate and limit the mobility of a superior military force. And so Republicans are using the same tactics that have gone that had preceded the Civil War. Rory O'Connor, there's a document that says we will stick to the old ways, we will perfect the old ways, and that's how we will succeed. The press turns against these tactics in a very public way, and I have an image in the book that is demonizing the Republican forces for pulling down the trees, for blocking the roads, for destroying the landscape. And the newspaper criticizes the anti-treaty forces, saying this is the Ireland that they'd want, is to destroy it, to bring it down with them. Quite ironic, given that the previous year these were the tactics being used to frustrate the British.
I want to circle back to the focus on the title of your book, The Enduring Ruin. As I said, one meaning was that buildings and the environment endured or suffered ruin. But the other meaning of that, of course, is that the ruin also endured. And this gets us to the question and brings us full circle from destruction to reconstruction and restitution.
Yeah.
To what extent was the damage done in any of these conflicts, whether it's 1916, War of Independence, Civil War, to what extent do you think it was satisfactorily restored, or was there damage done which was permanent? Were landscapes, both urban and rural, changed permanently as a result of what they experienced during these years?
Yeah. Well, let me take that in two senses, into the natural environment and into the built environment. This is actually the work I'm currently engaged in, is the post-revolution concepts of environment and policy of restoration in the Irish Free State. And in the early portions of this work in which I'm engaged, I find that the restoration of land is pursued only to the extent that it's compensated for. So, as I mentioned, cut up fields or cut up roads are repaired with the money that's forwarded to the local councils to do so. Reforestation or afforestation is a slow process. It's something that Sinn Féin really took on in the War of Independence period, founding an Arbor Day, in which little saplings are sent to hundreds of the Cumann councils to plant. But I'm not finding in the Free State period environment as being a priority regarding its restoration, beyond maybe the initial damage it had suffered due to the conflict. But that's research is still in its early stages. As far as the built environment, it's equally difficult to trace, because there are some instances in which, say, a destroyed barrack that was occupied by the Royal Irish Constabulary is repaired for use by An Garda Síochána. But there's other cases in which it's abandoned. The projects are abandoned. There's lots of other damage that I need to follow up on. The damage the IRA does to lighthouses, to courthouses, to municipal buildings during the War of Independence. These are areas that I'll have to track down individually to see. But as far as the legislation goes and the compensation files that I've seen, it all seems to be individual claims for damage and destruction that are seeking restitution. But that is to say that enduring ruin meant that ruin was visible and that continued to be throughout the post-revolutionary 1920s and beyond. And I always go back to the delay in restoring the General Post Office, which isn't reopened until the late 1920s. I often think that by keeping the GPO in ruin, it is almost a environmental statement that this is the inheritance of the revolution, is that this is the general headquarters of the rebels. This is an important and venerated site. And it's something that maybe the Free State is not particularly anxious to repair early on, but comes a bit later to show that stability has perhaps returned to the state through the Cosgrave administration. So there's politics to be played with environments as well.
Well, I suppose there was in some ways it was a good thing some of the damage in 1916 hadn't been fully restored by 1922, seeing as it was damaged all over again.
That's right. We'll just other side of the street and wreck it again. Yeah.
And I suppose that to hone in on that theme of the ruin which endured, if we think of, say, images of something like Moore Hall in Mayo, that stands as a symbol of the damage which was lasting and was never restored. And Moore Hall brings me on to the theme of sort of big houses, which
Yeah.
were, I suppose, would it be fair to say the destruction of big houses uh, was a disproportionately noticeable aspect of environmental destruction in the Civil War in particular?
Now, I cede all authority to Terence Dooley, of course,
Yes,
for
and
this.
I just said I think both of your books coming out as they did at the same time
Yeah.
was very timely, and I think the two of them being read together work very well.
Yeah, I'm really indebted to Terry for his insights. We had breakfast in Maynooth once, and we were talking about each other's books, and we were both very excited about what was happening. What the difficulty in writing the chapter on the Civil War came from the fact that there were so many multiple factors contributing to environmental destruction, both in maybe an extra military sense with land grabbing and agrarian violence, but also with the destruction of big houses, taking advantage of the vacuum of power that we see in certain areas of security in the state to destroy big houses as a symbolic act, as an anti-colonial act, as something that we might see as a disproportionate concentration of environmental violence. But I think you're right to mention that this is a concentrated act against a specific target that has political connotations. Yes.
And I think what interests me about that is the way in which your approach in this book of looking at the conflict from the environmental lens and uh, going through things like the Bureau statements to look ahead, to look for evidence of the environment. What that does is allows it's a way of intersecting with other themes, because looking at the destruction of big houses also gives us a different perspective on
Mm.
the experience of, say, the Southern Loyalists
Yes.
during the conflict, but also from the compensation files I've looked at myself. Um, the lens you're looking at gives us a lot more about gender and the experience of women property holders making claims for compensation.
Mhm.
So just, maybe if you could say a bit more about how an environmental approach also enhances our understanding of some of the other aspects and approaches to studying the revolution.
Well, I think the environmental approach and the gender approach to studying revolution can go hand in hand quite well. Throughout the book, I talk about what are considered to be masculine spaces or feminine spaces um, being turned on their heads. The number and the severity and the experience of home raids, for instance, really militarizes what is particularly a feminine space of the home, or at least rooms of the home, such as bedrooms or dressing rooms, that would be traditionally seen as private and off limits and very personal, are politicized because of the presence of military personnel and the upturning of dressers and beds and things of that nature. So to think of an environment as a gendered space, I think, is important in the context of the time in which it's taking place. This is particularly the case when we talked about 1917 and 18, with the politicizing of, say, a train platform, the hundreds of women that are flooding a train platform to welcome home brothers, husbands, relatives, really regenders that space in a sense. It's not something that I've thought about in greater depth. That is, in bringing the two together, but they certainly complement one another. As far as the compensation files, I think it's always very interesting to see women claiming on behalf of an estate that they've inherited, that they manage, that they own, and the ways in which, and you know this yourself from your own research, their claims are often diminished in the returns that they're given. A different kind of gendered compensation for restitution is very present in the legislation and in the reality of compensation in the 1920s.
You talked there about the women role of women in the archives and the way they're coming out of it, and it's only coming on stream now, but the National Archives are in the process of releasing the Compensation Personal Injury Commission.
Mm.
And just a brief look at what's been released so far, I think there's about 1,400 files or something, and 700 have been released. As you said, the names of women claiming on behalf of men comes up quite a lot in that. And that brings me to another question, which also links in with your own discussion of current work. Anybody interested in this theme, thinking that's a good way of looking at the Irish Revolution, what are the other directions this research could go on? People who take up your book and read it and go, that was great, now I want to do something along those lines. What directions can the environmental history of the Irish Revolution go in now that we have access to all of these materials that have been released in the last decade?
That's a great question, and it's something that I would welcome any student or anybody interested in to contact me and we have a discussion about this. But the way I see it going is there's been such an emphasis on literary representation of environment, say in the 19th century, and how this informs a sense of place in an individual and in a community. And so when the destruction of a barracks or a town hall or something comes to pass, it's really more than the destruction of a building, it's an attack on a community. So the literature of the period, I think, would be important, be an important avenue to explore. The ways in which environment is described, processed, and maybe prioritized in writing is an area that I'd be particularly interested in exploring myself. But to go further, I think we are going to be seeing work come out on compensation because of the volume of material that's been released regarding compensation. And what arguments could come out of that could go in several different directions. It could come from a further critique of the Free State in the first 10 years of its existence. It could come in the sense of material used for reconstruction, where we're getting granite, where we're getting our wood framing. That would be, I think, more aligned to a pure environmental study of the period. And I think also we could look at the development of agriculture in the Free State after the Revolution, and how revolutionaries during the 16 to 23 period are conceptualizing what a Free State would look like in an environmental sense. If we had control over the natural resources of the country, what could we do to industrialize Ireland to a greater extent, to preserve Ireland's environments in ways that hadn't been done before? And what priorities could government place on the statute books for the preservation of Irish landscapes? I think we see this in some extent with the founding of national parks throughout the 20th century and the protection of lands. But the way people were thinking about and anticipating what freedom would mean and how that could translate into environmental protections and development, I think would be really interesting departures going forward.
That response prompts a question in my mind, to the extent, do you think an opportunity was missed at any point? I mean, I take, for example, 1916 and the desire of Dublin Corporation that the reconstruction wouldn't just get the businesses back up so that they could pay rates and keep the keep the corporation going, but also that they would widen the streets, that they would make sure the rebuilt buildings were suitable for the landscape, and basically the corporation seeing this as an opportunity for improvement. Was that opportunity taken, or do you think there were missed opportunities here?
I think there were missed opportunities. I think I call it the Dublin missed a Haussmann moment. It missed the opportunity, as we saw in Paris in the 19th century, to restructure the landscape to make it maybe more accessible in ways. And I think the opportunity is missed not necessarily for lack of vision. There are certainly many who suggest a reconfiguration of Dublin city centre after the Rising. But what comes into play is the finances of it, and the insurance policies often pay out for the restoration of a building as it stood previous. And so lots of building fronts, and they go down to the very architectural drawings of the distance between the front piece of a building and the street itself must be uniform in lots of ways. So there's a desire to restore rather than improve. And that certainly, particularly in the case of Dublin, is a missed opportunity.
And I suppose the context of the war didn't help either, and the price of materials, the
Absolutely.
ability to get them in, and even the availability of labor. Because uh, once the war ends, you see the restoration of Dublin speeds up quite a bit
Hmm.
in 1919 and
Yeah.
1920. So I suppose maybe there's a bit of bad timing there in terms of the context of the war.
Yeah, demobilization, really aids the speed of reconstruction because of the labor saturation that comes back. But yeah, it could have been a different city center for sure.
Surprises. I'm always interested in surprises when we're doing research. Was there anything you expected to find which you didn't and were surprised that wasn't there? Or were there things that jumped out at you that you were not expecting?
Well, there were many aha moments in the archives, which
They're
I
always
was
the
I
best.
love it, which I was promptly shushed by the clerks
But
and
that
the
happens to me all the time.
archivists. Yeah. Um, I I was always very happy. I mean, I know we're not supposed to propose, we're not supposed to structure our arguments and then look for ways to support them with evidence. Let the evidence tell the story. The evidence tells a story of an intimate connection between the environment and the Irish people. And what I was always struck by is the very mundane um, consequences of environmental destruction. The many people who were frustrated by the fact that the IRA had felled on a tree across a very busy road or road access road, and that they couldn't get to the milk to the dairy on time before it's spoilage, and there was frustration in that regard. Or the fact that the Crown forces would rile some locals out of bed to move trees and everything, and then the next day there'd be another tree over the road that the IRA would have fallen. So I think it's mainly the experience of the everyday person that really struck me. There's an episode in which there's a contest for public space in which there's some fatalities, and a commemorative cross is raised at the crossroads, and then it's taken down by the Crown forces, and it's reestablished by the grieving families. That to me seems like a real view into the local importance of commemorating death, but also of establishing an environmental presence for that commemoration. I'm always struck when I'm looking through the compensation files for the Civil War. I wouldn't call them petty claims, but I would call them, people are claiming for one pane of glass that had been broken, or their horse had fallen into a trench and sprained its ankle, and they're submitting for the veterinary bill, things like that. So there's a large compensation culture that emerges after this legislation is passed, and it's always, I think, fun to put together the everyday stories of people in that regard.
Well, the ones I've looked at, I have been very taken by the number of bicycles that
Yes,
were claimed for. Brian Griffin
yes.
has written an excellent article on bicycles in the Irish Revolution
Hmm.
in the Irish Sword a while back. But the bicycle, I think Longford must have been full of bicycle thieves during the War of Independence and the Civil War.
Yeah.
Our focus has been very much on Ireland and what was happening in Ireland. If we were to
Mhm.
broaden our lens a bit, because you have done this in other work where you've made comparisons between Dublin and Paris, to the outsider interested in the broader theme of environmental history and environmental history of conflict and the environment during guerrilla conflicts, not necessarily just in an Irish context, how does this example of looking at the Irish War of Independence, what could other scholars take from this?
I think the nature of guerrilla warfare is a lesson that the Irish give to the world, in an environmental sense as well as in a military sense. I think the history of Reconstruction in the broader period of the First World War is a place where Ireland and the scholarship on the Revolution needs to claim a place. Hugh Clout's book on the reconstruction of France and, well, the occupied territories of France and Belgium during the First World War is a great blueprint um, to develop a study on Ireland in the same context. Tate Keller's book on the environmental history of the First World War is important. The environmental history of conventional conflict often deals with the contamination through munitions, the industrial mobilization of the economy to meet demands for munitions and things like that. Ireland doesn't really fall into those types of categories, but I think what it provides is an interesting context to the scale of environmental damage in war. Something we don't need to talk to, we don't need to look beyond the Western Front to see the destruction of trees on an industrial scale and what that meant for the landscapes of France and Belgium and beyond. But when we think about it in an Irish context, as I mentioned before, it's a much more intimate impact on communities than the industrial impact we see further afield. So I think my book in particular, but future studies on the environmental history of Ireland place it in a wider conversation about the 1920s and 30s in Europe, Reconstruction, the development of industry, reforestation, in those types of environmental issues.
I think maybe to draw our discussion now to a close, what I'm getting from the conversation is that your book has it's fit in nicely with an emerging theme of studying environmental history of conflicts. We see it the environmental history, the American Civil War, the First World War has been a popular focus for study in the last 10 years, and I think it fits in well into this. But you've also intersected with emerging themes, very pertinent themes in the revolution. We talked about gender, we talked about the role of the Southern Loyalists, and there your last point, I think, fits in with the popularity of looking at the revolution from the global perspective. Yeah. So I think in the course of 50 minutes or so, I think in the course of our discussion, we have focused not just on the immediate focus of this book on the environment, but we have shown the ways in which an environmental focus for looking at the Irish Revolution also intersects with all of these broad themes. Yeah. And just to draw again, I really think you really hit on a fantastic title there. You have shown us both how the Irish environment endured ruin and how the ruin endured and was left as a legacy of the Irish Revolution. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great conversation.